topics that I was going to cover tonight: hardening off. I'm going to give you a calendar for hardening off, and then talk about kind of that timing where we're, can go look back in time for what you've done already, and we'll talk about that. And then just some ideas about cold frames, and then transplanting. So the goal of seedling care, of all these different things that we're talking about tonight, is to not stress those baby plants. If we can keep them from being stressed, then they can just do better. So that is the overall why of what we're doing. So what is hardening off exactly? This is slowly exposing the plants to the outdoor elements that they're not used to. So sun, wind, colder temperatures, or just that more variation. Inside we've got an even temperature and they're not used to that. So ideally we would do this over about 2 weeks, and you can use a cold frame, and that can really help as a time saver. The hardening off process is most important for those warm season crops, such as tomatoes and peppers and some of the others. And because the cold season crops like kale and even some of the lettuces, they're just a little bit, they're just wired a little bit more for colder temperatures, if you will. And another tidbit is you do not want to fertilize during the hardening off phase. So you don't need to. Okay. And part of the reason for that is because the plants are already doing a lot. They don't also need fertilizer during this period. Just the temperature changes, the sun, even if you're keeping them in the shade, which is what you should do in the beginning. And I'll go over some of those details, but their plant growth rate is going down. And so they're trying to do some of these other things like strengthen their roots, make the cell walls thicker, the waxy layer thicker, and just trying to prepare themselves when they're in this new environment. So, and they're expecting to not get frozen, so the amount of water is reduced for the freeze-prone portion of the cells. And this is a small chart of the warm season crop. These are the crops that we're going to start inside as seedlings and then plant out. So just some examples. So when to begin hardening off? So I was looking at my magic crystal ball called Google and asking when is the last frost date in Idaho Falls. And so what I found was June 17th. So you can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so then I'm going to go over the sample hardening schedule. And so then what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 16 days, because we want about 14 to 16 days. So you could just subtract the 14 days, but I'm going to go 16 days and subtract. So that's starting around June 1. So we've still got plenty of time if you've got your plants started inside. Okay, so day one, we want to pick the warmest part of the day. Say it's a high of 70 and there's no danger of frost during that time period. You may still have a danger of frost at nighttime. So we're going to put our plant starts out for about 2 hours. And as I mentioned up at the top, sample. So like if you don't get home from work until 5:30 or 6, you were just going to use the amount of time that you have. So you could even do it in the evening, but you're just going to do a couple hours. And especially if it is in the evening where it's already starting to cool off or something like that, you may want to keep it to that 2 hours. And then you're just going to increase every day 1 additional hour. And so the second day we're doing 3 hours and then 4 hours. And so if you do have that luxury of putting them out from 3 to 5 and then increasing it from 2 to 5, then 2 to 6 on day 4, 5 hours. So, this would be ideal, just adding an hour per day. Through this first week, you're keeping them out of the wind and out of the sun. The plants going from inside to outside, they're still getting plenty of lumens, even if they're in the shade, because the sun is so powerful. You want to be checking them each day to see if they're drying out, and definitely you're going to be wanting to give them some water. You're just going to kind of keep checking, and the top can get dried out and the roots may still have enough water underneath. But if you have, good drainage, so they're not sitting in a contained pot, if the water can drain out, you can water them, starting on day 2 and maybe every day if you're getting, if you have dry conditions. Okay. So then we're going to enter into week 2. And we're still looking at that middle of the day where there's no danger of frost, but we're starting earlier in the morning and going till about 6 at night. And then on the second week, we want to start giving them some sunshine when it's not the most powerful. So that first hour, we would put them out in the sun, and then they're going to get a little bit of mild wind with that 1 hour. Again, we're checking them every day for drying out. And then at about 11 o'clock, we're going to move them back into that shady spot wherever they were. And maybe this is on a cart, that would be most convenient, just depending on how many starts you have. And then we're just still adding an hour every day, giving them a longer and longer time frame. If you have to leave for work and you can come home at lunch and kind of handle this, that's a good way. But if you don't have that luxury, then you'll have to just figure something else out and modify the schedule to fit your lifestyle, and maybe get some help from kids after school or something like that. So we're getting down to the end of the second week, and they're now out from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. So they're getting 12 hours. They're getting about half that day in sun and wind. And, you don't want them to be in a windstorm. If you have a windstorm coming, I would bring them in. But this is, kind of a mild wind, and they're getting direct sun. So then by the end of that 2 weeks, they should be pretty strong. And we have no danger of frost. So if you do have a danger of frost at night, you're going to keep bringing them back in at night. But once that danger of frost has passed, you can leave them out for 24 hours for 1 to 2 days, and then you're ready to plant them outside, hopefully timed with a good Saturday. And so this could be 6+ hours of sun. And you can also watch the plants for stress. You're going to just look at them and kind of judge for yourself if if they can kind of handle that longer and longer period, just, kind of depending on what your plants are. And if you are keeping them watered, they should be able to handle this 2-week schedule. So now you've got to day 15 and your danger of frost has passed and you're ready to plant outside. So the spring planting calendar, now we're going to go back a little bit in time. And we talked about that planting date outside. And so when you started your seeds indoors, you may or may not have read this. Sometimes it's just exciting to start seeds in February because of cabin fever, and that's fine. But the seed packet sometimes will tell you that if you are, that you start them 6 weeks ahead of that date or something like that. And so, so if you started seeds in February, that's fine. You'll get more yield sooner. You're just going to have to transplant. So the Moscow tomato, this one says it will produce fruit in 80 to 90 days. So that's a short season tomato. So that's excellent. The germination is 8 to 14 days at 50 to 75 degrees. So for the Moscow tomato, if we say we want to start our harvest no later than August 20th, so that's a goal we're setting based on our first frost date of September 3rd. So we want to have like a couple weeks to harvest tomatoes. And so so we're going with that 80 to 90 days. So I put these dates into my Excel spreadsheet. The last frost is June 17th, and the first frost is approximately September 3rd. So that's a 78-day growing season. So if this is an 80 to 90-day tomato, we have got to start these inside. So if I even started these seeds on May 1st, and my seeds have germinated by May 15th with this goal of August 20th, I'm still getting 97 days from germinations, but that's only, maybe 7 days of harvest. So really this first harvest could be August 3rd. If we got 80 days, if we were, if we really took care of that tomato plant, it didn't get stressed, it had all the fertilizer it needed, then we could have that first harvest around August 3rd. So I just kind of wanted to give you that math. So you can calculate for yourselves each of your crops. You can put that into an Excel spreadsheet. And all I did was subtract, I just put in an equation to subtract September 3rd from June 17th, and that gives the 78 days, and right here as well. So you can subtract from the start of the seeds or germination, but germination makes more sense. Okay, so here's an example of a cold frame. for hardening off. And when you first put plants out, if you're not, okay, so you can start your plants in the cold frame. They may take a little bit longer to germinate, just depending on how hot that is. But if you are starting your plants inside and then you're going to put them into the cold frame, they still can get too hot in there or too much sun. So you want them in a cloudy day in the shade with the top closed. Sometimes the cold frames aren't movable. And so you just will have to judge for yourself if you can get them in there without them getting too much sun. So in that case, cold frame that is for hardening off, you might want it, say, on the west side, and not necessarily on the south side of your building, but that south side wall will hold heat. And so that is useful. But if you can keep it open during the day, that might work well. And some of these cold frames have the ability to open them at higher heights. So this might be a cold day. You would only open it, a small amount to let some of that, kind of mild wind and some temperature variation in. And then if it is freezing at night, you're still going to close it at night, hopefully, before it gets too cold. So you're trapping some of that heat in. One of the examples that I think was from Minnesota Extension is that that you can put a cold frame, you can put manure around a cold frame or put a cold frame into a manure pile. And that manure pile, as it's decomposing, is putting off heat. And so that can also heat your plants. So it could be a little messy just depending on how you do it, but I thought that was kind of a fun idea. You can use like a 9-gauge wire and remay. And that is another way out if you have rows out in your garden rows. You can just do it right out there in the rows. Okay, and then just a few instructions for transplanting. So if you started your plants early, so we talked about that seed packet time. So if you started your plants, say in February, you probably already have transplanted, or your transplants can get a little bit root bound. But you can transplant them every, 3 to 4 weeks, or just, you're watching them growing. And I like to start the seeds in newspaper pots, and then you can just put that whole thing into a bigger pot, or if the timing's right, you can plant them outside and then that newspaper just disintegrates. So that's a nice option. When you're planting outside, you're going to dig a hole that's 2 times wider than the plant start, but just as deep, only as deep as the plant start. And then you're going to put that in the hole and then pull your soil back over. And sometimes I like to have just a bit of a well around the plant, so the water will stay down, going down towards the center of the plant. I like to water in with a liquid fertilizer, so putting like a fish fertilizer in a watering can and just giving each start down the row a start of fertilizer and water. You can just water in and then use like a granular fertilizer that those roots are going to be able to take up later. But definitely you want to water them in. And then if you are going to use drip lines, you would lay those in after you've planted your row. And then I was going to show you one more picture of this cold frame. And what this guy did was he planted right into the cold frame. So he put a cold frame over this bed. So this part, no cold frame. This part has a cold frame. So I thought that was kind of an interesting strategy.
Greg did point out something here on that frost date thing. Yours may actually be really close to 0% of probability of frost.
Okay.
And mine is 50% probability of frost. It's the average. Mine is average last frost date. In other words, half of the time it's going to be later and half of the time it's going to be earlier. And this year it'll probably be later. But that's the average frost date. And so that might be the difference why our dates were different.